1800s, men lacked the shaving equipment that's available to them today. Many of them grew beards. Sharon Kalmus's great-grandfather took beard growing to great lengths. Today, Susan Stowe is here to tell about Sharon's great-grandfather.
Here's an immigrant tale that seems impossible to be true, but yet it is. And it's the story of Hans Nielsen Langseth. It's really Sharon Langseth Kalmus's story to tell, but I'm just sharing it with you because it's so amazing. It was customary among Norwegian immigrant men to grow their beard over the winter. And when he was 28 years old, he decided to grow a beard over the winter, and he never shaved again. So when the chin whiskers started getting in the way of his everyday activities, he decided that he had to do something else and get the food particles out of his beard as well. So he used a stick, rolled the whiskers around it, put it in a bag, and stuffed it in his vest. Well, after half of a century of beard growth, what happened is that for a skinny man, he certainly had a paunch. On festive occasions, he would unroll the beard and fling it over his shoulder for a grand display. In the summer, Hans would sit on a chair out in the yard, and somebody in the family would wash the beard and hang it on the line to dry. But in the winter, when he wanted to wash the beard, it had to set over the back of several straight chairs in order to make a clothesline. With the length of his beard getting up to 17 feet 4 inches, he was approached to be in Ringling Brothers Circus as having the longest beard in the world. It turned out to be a short contract because the people didn't believe it was his beard, and they would reach over the barrier where he sat and pull the end of it. He was insulted, and it hurt. The next notoriety came in the form of a contest, and he was traveling west to the special Days of 49 whisker contest in Sacramento, California. There he received a gold slug with an engraved motto on it, King of Whiskers. He won hands down. By the time he died in 1927, his beard had been growing for 53 years. It had reached 18 feet and 6 inches. That was quite amazing. The beard was removed and given to his youngest son, Peter, who put it in a bag in a trunk in the attic, and pretty much was left there undisturbed for about 40 years. And then Peter and his son Russell were going through trunks in the attic. They took the beard out to look at it. It was still chestnut brown at the end, various shades of brown in the middle, and white towards the top where it had been removed. And it was amazingly well preserved, so they decided to approach the Smithsonian Institution to see if they would like to have this record-breaking beard on exhibit. As it turned out, that's where it is today in Washington, D.C., at the Smithsonian. What's even more amazing is that in 2012, there was a microbrewery in Drammen, Norway, and they must have been looking on the internet and came across Hans's photo. So for their Bestefar, or grandpa beer, it was Handbryggeriet Bestefar. They have the picture of Hans Langseth and his champion beard. So Sharon Langseth Kalmus cornered the market around the area, and she's given samples to all of her Langseth clan.
Susan, thank you for telling Sharon's story about her interesting great-grandfather.
Vel bekomme.
Most of these interviews have involved talking about ancestors from Norway. We have a very interesting story this morning from Axel Torvi talking about the family hotel.
Ron, my family had were unusual in the fact that they had a hotel, and the hotel was on one side of the mountain on Illustrafjord, and there, in back of it is the mountains. There's a mountain range, and nowadays there's a bunch of ski resorts on the other side of that mountain. The farm was on the other side, down a little ways towards Songdal. They were just north of the Sonya Ford. And the hotel itself was sold a couple years ago, and we were kind of wondering if they retained the name.
Oh, yeah?
They might have changed the name. The farm itself was sold back in 1912, and the people that moved on were not even related to us, but they're very good to us. And they take care of the gravestones that are at that site, and as they came, my relatives that have gone over there have not been very welcome at the hotel itself because the people fear that our relatives would be taking advantage of the privilege of having relatives that have a hotel.
Sure.
It was only open from May to September, and from September to the following May, the folks, the great-grandparents and stuff like that, always went down to Bermuda.
Oh.
I have no idea what happened during the war years, because we do know that the Germans took over most of the hotels at that time. And there are many stories told that the resistance fighters would work in the kitchens and sleep under the tables during those wars. The folks, my grandfather came over and he settled down towards Mankato, and wouldn't you know, he became infatuated with an itinerant preacher's daughter. And instead of taking a train to North Dakota, they actually were on a wagon train to the western part of South Dakota. And they were with a bunch of Saugnings, and her family must have been, the itinerant pastor must have been one of the wagons in the train, and they split up when they got up close to the Dakota border, and they ended up in Fosston and in Crookston. And eventually my grandfather went up by Drayton and up by that area west of Fargo and west of Grand Forks and Grafton, and he farmed there for many years. They were not really skilled, and they kind of complained about wearing out the soil. And a lot of times they had plagues of grasshoppers, plagues of Canadian thistle, and dust storms. And eventually one time they loaded up all the family and all the cattle into freight cars, and the women went into the caboose and they went to Radium, Minnesota.
Oh, my.
And eventually we all came back and we all ended up at Crookston, Minnesota.
Well, Axel, thank you so much for sharing with such an exciting story.
Thank you.
In the 1800s, women didn't have the opportunities that they have today. Although some worked and had jobs and ran the finances for the family. And that sounds like Mary Beth Muchler's grandmother.
Oh, yes.
Tell us about Olava.
My grandmother, Olava Clavin, was born on a farm in 1881 on the island of Helgøy in Lake Musa in Norway, and that, I understand, is the largest lake in Norway. She lived there with her parents and her 5 sisters and 1 brother. 5 children had either been stillborn or died early after they were born, so that was a sad situation. After she finished her schooling, she went to Christiana and worked as a servant, and there became engaged to my grandfather. Now, we don't know if they met there in Christiana or if they met in Hedmark, where they both originated from. My grandfather left Christiana in 1903 and immigrated to the U.S., and his passage was paid by an uncle who lived near Blair, Wisconsin. My grandfather was a blacksmith by trade, and so he opened his own shop and sent money back to Norway for my grandmother to buy a Christmas gift for herself. And so she ended up buying some sterling silver spoons, teaspoons, tablespoons, and coffee spoons. And because they were only engaged, she had her maiden initial engraved on the spoons because it would have been presumptuous of her to put an E on there. My grandfather, Engebretsen, was then supposed to be saving money for her passage. And when she came in 1904, he didn't have enough money. And so the uncle that had paid for his passage ended up paying for her passage as well. Now, my grandmother, being this strong, independent woman, took it upon herself to repay that loan because, after all, they weren't married, and she felt that it was her debt. And so she moved to Minneapolis and became a servant at Fair Oaks Mansion, which was a very large estate in Minneapolis, owned by William Washburn, who was an attorney, a businessman, flour milling and railroading, and he also was a U.S. representative and a U.S. senator. Well, in 1906, that debt was repaid, and so they married and moved to Hudson, Wisconsin. My grandfather, although he was an excellent craftsman, his business sense did not improve, and so she became the keeper of the money. With her frugalness, they were able to pay for the passage of her sister and his brother to come to America. She really believed in saving for a rainy day, and she instilled this in her 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, and she insisted that they all have $1,000 in the bank before they got married. And that might explain why my parents, who started dating when they were 16 years old, didn't get married until they were 26. But that's
Well,
it.
thank you so much, Mary Beth, for relating the story about your grandmother,
Well,
Olava.
you're welcome. She's probably turning over in her grave.
We now have with us Alyssa Riffenberg, who will tell us about her great-great-great-grandfather.
Okay. His name was Christian Olsen Hegdahl. That's the name he was born with. He got Olsen because his dad's name was Ola, so that would make him Ola's son. And Hegdahl was the name of his family farm.
Oh.
His farm was on a beautiful inlet surrounded by cliffs called a fjord.
Oh.
He met a girl named Mette on the other side of the fjord, and they got married and they moved to her farm. He had to change his name again because he was living on a farm called Trogstad, so his name would be Christian Trogstad now. In Norway, there were a lot of rules, and there was a class system. So, like, if you're born a farmer, you were a farmer for the rest of your life, or whatever job you were born with. So you couldn't be born a farmer and become a rich business owner or a governor or anything. And also, the family farm was always given to the oldest son. And since Christian was a third son, he wouldn't be able to get his farm. So Mary's brothers have been writing to him, and they're saying how America was free from all those rules and everybody was equal. So finally, Christian made the difficult decision to leave his pregnant wife and go to America. And the boat ride was 2 months long. And when he came to Minneapolis, he had to change his name again
Oh, my.
to Chris Hegdahl. He chose Hegdahl because there are already way too many Olsens in Minnesota. And he lived with his brothers-in-law, who supported him because everything was new in America, like the language and the culture and the food and everything. So they helped him. And finally, when Christian's son was 6 months old, his wife came to join him, and his son died on the boat, and he got sick. It was kind of common for people to do that because the boats were dark and dirty and a lot of people get sick.
Yes.
So, but then they had another son. So then Chris became a carpenter, and then Mette got sick, and she was sick for a really long time, and she died. And she died when their son was only 6 years old.
Oh.
And since Christian was so dedicated to his job, when he was like really old and he had arthritis and all that stuff, he still held the hammer with his thumb and forefinger.
Oh my.
I realized that my ancestor story is similar to a lot of stories in the past and stories in the future, like right now. And I feel lucky to be one of the what is now 500 Hegdals living in the Twin Cities area.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Alyssa, for telling this wonderful story about your great-great-great-grandfather coming to America. There are always many special things about Grandpa and Grandma's house, especially for small children. Don Halverson is here to relate some great memories of his grandparents' home in Spring Grove, Minnesota.
Yeah, it was a special place. A lot of memories there. I think from the time I was 5 until I was about 14, I spent a lot of weekends there. I didn't live there. I lived in Rochester, but I'd come down often because there was always the siblings getting together and the cousins. I grew up with my cousins, pretty much all of them. And it was a place to stay. I remember when I was in 5th grade, my father went to Greenland to work with the Thule Air Force Base. And so I spent the entire half a year down there in Spring Grove living with my grandparents, going to school down there. And so there's a lot of people that I know from that experience. There's a lot of times that I was down there and had a good time and played with my cousins and whatever. The house was actually built in 1906. It was about the first house in the block, or the place. It was wide open. There was space all around it. Now it's one of the cornerstones of the east part of Main Street. But it was when my grandmother died, it was sold out of the family. It was in our family for about 50 years. And then after she died, they sold it out of the family, and it stayed out of the family for another 50 years. And eventually, in 2002, my cousin bought it back and restored it. In fact, it looks almost better than it was when it was in the beginning. So he did a very good job with it. And now it's a place that anybody from the Silling family can stay if they go down there, you know, on a weekend or something. And he always it's kind of the center place for reunions. Spring Grove has a reunion every 7th year of the decade. And so there's a big deal. People come from all over, and our family usually kind of keys our reunions to that time too. So it's kind of the place that you go, the place you hang out. And the only thing that is interesting, well, the other thing that's interesting about the house is that he did most of the work himself on the inside of it. They said he built the whole house, but I don't know if he had time. I mean, I don't know if he built it from the bricks up, but he built hand carved the whole stairway, the newels and the stairwells going up and up the place and the rest of it, and did that in his spare time, I guess. I don't know. And there's a room in the parlor, between the parlor and the living room, that it's an oak door. It's a folding door, and if you can actually open it and close it with one finger. So he had some talent and some degree of I don't know where he picked it up from. He might have picked it up from his grandparents. I'm sure in the old country they had to do a lot of their own building. So it might have just been something that he was always used to. But it's always a place to go back to and a place to enjoy.
Well, thank you, Don, for sharing your special memories about your grandparents and their house in Spring Grove, Minnesota.
Thank you.
Many Norwegian immigrants played a strong role in establishing communities in the areas where they settled. Joanne England is here to tell us about her great-grandfather as one of those individuals.
Thank you. My great-grandfather, Ananias Sand, is the person I want to talk about. He was born in Norway in 1843. I want to mention that around his birth, his mother, Oleana, was born in 1813, so she's 200, so we're celebrating her 200th birthday. She was born in January. And had Ananias when she was 30, and the birth record says he was her first mistake. So he was born before the couple was married, and the father disappeared shortly after, and they never found him, even when the estate was settled in 1850. So whether he died at sea or we don't know. So Ananias was alone with his mother as he grew up, and they worked on farms, local farms. And then he married Marit, a local woman, and Oleana lived with them until 1881 when they came to the United States. And five children came along. My grandfather was one of them. He was 9 at the time, Paul. And they settled in Wisconsin. And Wisconsin was not a very comfortable place to be at that time. They lived up near Cumberland, north of Cumberland. Timberland was the town. And when his son died, an infant son, a toddler, he carried the body into Cumberland 15 miles for the funeral, and there were no roads. He was one of the first names on the list for the local church. He had met at his home to start the local school. When his youngest daughter was born, 1890, I'm thinking that's right. They were busily getting the community put together. He got his homestead for his property. 2 fellows wanted the same piece of property. They were the first 2 settlers in Timberland. And so they drew sticks, and Ananias got the piece that he wanted. He was a circuit minister, preacher, and farmer, and quiet organizer, I think, by what I can tell. His wife died in 1901, while the youngest 2 children were 15 and 11. They had 10 children altogether. Only 5 survived to adulthood. There are 3 boys who show as adults, and one of those died in Cloquet. And my grandfather died in 1918 in the flu epidemic. And they had 4 girls. The 4 girls lived through to their 80s and 90s, some in Minnesota and some in Cloquet. One of the older daughters moved to Cloquet when she got married, and after all the children were gone, Ananias moved to Cloquet also, and lived with her. He was about 60 at that time, and lived out his life there. And his obituary said he was an evangelist, so apparently he was still doing the circuit riding preacher stuff during his last years. His mother died in 1902, so his wife died in 01, and his mother in Norway in 02, and I don't know if he ever knew that or not. And then he died in Cloquet and was buried died in 1923, and was buried in the Timberland Cemetery, again with the rest of the family.
Well, Joanne, thank you so much for your interesting story about your ancestor.
Thank you. They're fun stories.
Many Norwegian immigrants were successful and prosperous due to character and hard work. Bob Barderson, your father was very successful. Please tell us about him.
Well, you just saw a picture of him, and that was when my oldest daughter in his lap, taking an afternoon nap right after lunch on a Saturday. We lived out in west central Minnesota near Benson, Minnesota, and our pastor served 4 congregations at the time. And so we only had church every other Sunday except on the major Sundays, like Christmas and Easter. But that didn't excuse us from going to having church, because my dad always gathers around the radio, and we listened to WCAL out of Northfield, Minnesota at St. Olaf College, so we still got our church on Sundays. And in regard to church, we also had both Norwegian and English services, and this continued into the 1950s. And as far as my dad, he was a stern man, but very loving, and I suppose he was known as a disciplinarian, because when you did stuff, you had to do it right, because he'd been a carpenter earlier in life, and when you saw a board, you saw it straight so you get things right. And whenever we were active in the community, like through church or school or 4-H, we were very active in 4-H. And we always were taking part in this. And a lot of times we had, I know we had activities where some of the neighbor people wouldn't let their kids go because they were too busy farming. Well, my dad we always got the farm work done, but for some reason or other, he always said, we got to do these things first, and then we'll get the farming done anyway. And it seemed to work out because we always had a successful farm. And as far as community, my dad was so active in the farming. In fact, I remember coming home from college and working on the farm in the summertime, and I always kidded him about being a white-collar farmer because he was never home. He was very active first of all, he was very active in the farm program, where he was the chairman of the county committee and also on the committee for many years, and that's why he was so busy. But he also was so active. He was a treasurer of the West Bank Township Board for 30 years, and he was on the Swift County Fair Board for 20 years, and he was active in like the Swift County Historical Society and the Farm Bureau and many other things. And then, of course, during the Second World War, there was all kinds of extra committees that I can't even remember that were formed because of the war effort. And seemed like he was on every committee that came along. And because of this, he managed to, and he only had a 3rd grade education. In fact, my brother calculated that at the time, he was the oldest son on a farm. And, as an oldest son, you were required to do a lot of work. And so my brother figured out that, I suppose he'd talked to him enough, that he probably only went to the minimum 40 days a year. Oh. And if you figure 40 days times 3, he had 120 days of education, which is about equivalent to a 1st grade education. And yet he managed to, because of all his community activities, he ended up in the 1958 centennial edition of the Who's Who in Minnesota. I was home one time from school at the U, and he had a math problem for me to do. Now, he figured it out. He had the answer. But here I was actually studying math at the time, and I was home for a week, and it took me a whole week to try to, he wanted me to write it up some way, so it actually could be handed in to somebody. And it took me the whole week to try to figure out how to put the problem together, because he had the answer. He'd done it all in his head. And so for somebody with a 3rd grade education, that's pretty good. So I'm very proud of him. And so,
well, thank you, Bob, for sharing the stories about the character and hard work of your father.
Okay, thank you.
Many Norwegian immigrants became homesteaders and were often out on the prairie far away from trees. Jeannie Pearson is here to talk about her great-grandmother who was a homesteader.
Well, my great-grandmother, Christy Skola, was born in Hordaland County, Norway in 1836. And she was the oldest of 4 children. And as a female, even though she was the oldest, she couldn't inherit land. And she fell in love with Taurus Skola, and he and she agreed to marry and then immigrate to the Midwest in America. And they had plans to start a farm. And they'd heard about the Homesteading Act that President Lincoln had just signed in 1862. And she and Taurus moved to the Midwest and started a farm, a homestead. And if they worked the land and improved it for 5 years, it would have been theirs, free and clear. And that's what they did. And they chose land that was on the prairie, away from a river and away from trees. And so they had to build their first home out of sod that was newly cut out of the earth that had never been farmed before. And they had to dig a well for water. And they lived in their sod dugout, that's what our family called it, for 5 or 6 years. And they had 3 little children. And he worked so hard and she worked so hard. He died at a fairly young age, and she was only 32 the first time she was a widow. And in order to survive on the prairie, living in a sod dugout, she had her photo taken when she was around 32 years old and sent it home to Norway for a new husband. And her family found her another man by the name of Talev. She called him Tali Seversyke. Well, there was a little negotiation that went back and forth, and Christy asked Tali if he would agree to change his last name to hers, and Tali agreed. He was about 20 years older than she was, and they eventually got married a couple years after her first husband died, right after the Civil War, and he became an instant father with the 3 children under the age of 5. And he eventually would build her a frame house and a number of other outbuildings, and they succeeded and survived on this homestead, which they got title to. Many of us think that maybe she asked him to change his name because it was like a memory of her first husband. Also, she got credit toward homesteading the 5 years with the first husband that way. But this homestead succeeded and prospered, and there were many buildings that they built on their homestead, and they planted trees on the prairie to have shade. There is a story in the family that has come down that she had one of her babies when she was bringing her cows in for milking. You know, on the homestead, the people had to work from dawn to dusk, and she probably thought she had a little time before the baby came. Well, the baby didn't wait, and she had to have the baby in the pasture while the cows just stood there and watched and chewed their cud. And we have a nice photo of Christy when she was in her 60s with her 6 surviving children. And it shows that she really hadn't changed that much. Same hairstyle, the same clothing. But I'm very proud to have information about a female ancestor in my family, because that's very unusual to have any history of women, and who were homesteaders and farmers and housewives and mothers. But she was a model to us, and to me especially, as living the American dream.
Certainly. Well, thank you for sharing this story about your homesteading great-grandmother.
Thank you.